welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm very hot, but I'm good. Thank you ever so much for having me.
No, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for giving up your time to be on the podcast. I'm really excited about this.
I'm excited too.
So the first question that I ask every single guest on the podcast is, how do you refer to your disability? And the reason that I ask this is because everybody refers to their own disability very, very individually. And I'm always interested to know how people refer to it themselves.
I think I tend to just say I'm disabled, or pushed, I might say I'm a wheelchair user.
Yeah.
I'll talk about my diagnosis, but it's not, like I've got spina bifida and that's something I'll talk about off my own back. But I don't like sort of the presumption that people need to know my medical diagnosis. So I tend to just, stick with one, I'm disabled.
And I really like that, because I think a lot of people sometimes feel that people want them to give them a medical explanation, and they want that information almost so that they can process, but actually it's very much private information, and it's like it's your own to do with what you wish.
I think it's sort of useless information for most people as well, because if people know my medical diagnosis, it might scratch a niche or curiosity, but they're not going to do anything useful with that information unless they were like a doctor, and even they don't do anything great by that. So I would much rather people, ask me about like, how's the access, or, like somebody just come up to me the other day in a charity shop. And a lovely lady come up to me just to compliment me on my wheelchair, and it happens so rarely. And it always just feels so nice, because it's just recognizing it as like a cool bit of tech that actually looks quite pretty, as opposed to like this sort of tragic thing. I've gone off on a tangent, I'm sorry.
No, I love it. Tangents are the best thing on podcasts, because I always find like the conversation just goes in a different direction, but it's all still relevant. I love it.
Good. Sorry, you'll get a lot. But so basically I will tend to just say I'm disabled.
And I think it's really important that when people in general, not just like you and me, when people say they're disabled, it's just to accept it and not be like, no, you're not. Because there's been I've had it a lot where people are like, but you're not really. And I'm like, what? Like, how are we having this conversation, and how are you trying to argue against what I'm telling you, considering I'm the one that's disabled?
I think it's because people think it's like you're insulting yourself. Like I remember saying to a guy once, he said something like, what's wrong with you, or the usual charming question. And I was just like, oh, nothing, I'm disabled. And he was like, oh, I think you're definitely more abled than disabled. And I'm like, yeah, I'm really not. Like, clearly, like, what are you talking about? I think they just think it's, the equivalent to saying, I don't know, oh, I'm a shithead. And they go, oh, no, you're not. And it's like, no, it's not the equivalent. Like, it's just, that's how I identify. That's who I am, and that's fine.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like society, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, and I've said it multiple times on this podcast, but society in general has seemed to equate disability with an inadequacy. So as soon as you say disabled or disability, people are like, and they almost don't know how to take it. And I'm like, no, I'm going to say this word. I'm going to use this word because it accurately describes exactly what I need it to. And also it's not a bad word. Like, you shouldn't be fearing it.
And I think it's frustrating because they see that, as you say, like inadequacy, and that's always directed towards our broken, sick bodies, as opposed to seeing, the attitudes, the access barriers, etc., that, can be changed. And if more people knew about it, and more people, went into a restaurant and questioned why they don't have, disabled toilets or brown menus or whatever it is. But instead people just sort of hear disabled, think, oh, always see it through the medical, feel sorry for you because, it can't be fixed. And it's like, there's so much that can be fixed. But you just don't see it.
Exactly. And what was it like for you growing up? Because from what I know about you is that you've not always been a wheelchair user.
So I was like born with my disability, and kind of like hit all the milestones a little bit later than like, I didn't walk till I was a little bit older and stuff like that. But it was kind of smooth sailing until I hit my teenage years. And with spina bifida, because it's all to do with the nerves in your spine, that kind of sudden growth period in like adolescence can really sort of trigger it. So for me, everything got worse. And I sort of you know, I'd have stints in wheelchairs and on crutches and stuff like that all through secondary school, and a lot of time off and a lot of hospital appointments. And I hated it. I hated feeling different. I had to wear like orthopedic shoes, and all I wanted to do was, you know, wear kickers like all of my friends in the 90s did. And I just hated it. I just wanted to bury it, especially it was around like my teenage years that my incontinence really started to kind of kick in. And I just didn't tell anyone. I didn't seek any support because I was just so sort of ashamed, because you know, I was just a teenage girl and I just wanted to be like everybody else. But yeah, like through my 20s, I think when I had my first kid when I was 25, up until that point I was an absolute terror at, because I didn't like being disabled, I also didn't take care of myself at all. So I remember having like a toe amputated and then literally being discharged from hospital and going straight down the pub, because I was like, well, I'm not staying in and resting. I was really self-destructive, just a proper little menacey minx, just very, very naughty person. And then I got pregnant, and it kind of suddenly I was like, oh, I can't afford to be in and out of hospital all the time because I've got another infection, because I haven't bothered to rest or dress my foot in any way. So I just kind of really started looking after it and taking care of it, and then it really settled down. And then sort of 9 years ago, my third pregnancy, I just began to lose my mobility. And then suddenly it was just kind of really faced with it. And at first I was very much like, I called myself differently abled.
Isn't that a horrible phrase? Because I think at one point in time, I at least know like every single disabled person I know has also used that phrase. And then like upon reflection has been like,
because we're all in that kind of mindset of, well, you know, I'm not disabled like those other disabled people. Like, what does that, like, it was so ableist, and my way of thinking had been so ableist. And I think a lot of that was, you know, I remember growing up and, you know, we had like a family friend who was in a wheelchair, and I would see, I don't think I necessarily understood it at that age, but I knew that people were different, you know, people I knew. And I'd think, but you're not talking to him like you talk to everyone else. And I don't think I just had a real grasp of what it was, but I just knew like, I don't want to be treated like that, which is, again, like terrible. But in my kid head, I was like, well, I just don't want to be treated like that. So I'm not like that. I'm not disabled. And it wasn't really until I had a couple of things, really. Like I had a kid with the same disability as me, which changed, like really kind of was just such a moment, because it looked so beautiful on him. And I was like, how can I have hated my body for all these years and hated, like, you know, I've got a lump that comes with my spina bifida, and I, you know, and just all of that. But yet on him, I was like, oh my God, this is so precious. Like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I never wanted him to hear me talk about it in a negative way, because that's part of who he is as well. So that was a huge turning point for me. And then the next thing was like finding the disabled community, which I talk about all the time, because it really was just, it just was life-changing, because all of the stuff I had kind of internalized over the years, like when people would come up to me and say, what have you done? And I would just answer them and tell my whole medical history, because I felt I had to. And I remember the first time, one of the first things I wrote about to do with disability on my Instagram was that, not liking those questions. And I was so nervous posting it, because I was so used to, when I would say to people that I didn't like them, people would say things like, oh, but people are only, you know, being nice. And, you know, they don't mean any harm and all of that. And I would be put back in my box. Okay. So to write this post and then have loads of people comment and being like, oh, I hate it too, it makes me feel this, this, and this, was like, oh my God, this is just so validating. And yeah, it just changed everything. And I learned, you know, about the social model of disability and learning about different models of disability. Again, was able to sort of look back at like 30 odd years of my life and start unpicking it all, and just seeing it through a different, like seeing myself through a different lens, seeing disability through a different lens. And it's like an ongoing process, because, you know, I didn't discover all this stuff till I was like 37. So I spent so many years just having all of this internalized ableism and never questioning it, because I just thought that's how it was. So it's, the last sort of 4 years especially have just been, amazing.
And what I love about that is that you're not shying away from the fact that there was internalized ableism in your life, because I think a lot of people are almost like, you know, who talk in the disabled community, some people are like, you know, internalized ableism, it exists, but like, I've never had it. And then you're like, at some point everybody has had some form of internalized ableism, whether you're conscious of it or not. You have, and that's nobody's fault. It's the way that society has like put us in like a little corner, and that's what society has said. And it's not kind of until you almost break out of that and you almost do like your own research, or you look into it a bit more, that you realize actually how heavily ableist society is, and it's actually quite scary.
Oh, it's everywhere, like ableism and eugenics, and it's stuff that people, you know, ableism most people haven't heard of. Eugenics people seem to think is a thing of the past. Whereas when we look at, you know, the last couple of years with the pandemic, and we look at the treatment of disabled people, we look at things like, this is all getting a bit bleak now, but you know, like forced DNRs and all of that stuff. You know, like I'm at the point where I was so burnt out from spending a year sort of shouting about how disproportionately it was affecting disabled people and how many disabled people were dying, and people not giving a shit. And it was like, oh, okay, like, you know, just that apathy of me doesn't really affect me. And you're right, you know, everybody is ableist. You cannot live in this society, you know, even within our school systems. You know, we reward good health. When we look at work, you know, we reward good health. And if you're somebody who has to have a lot of time off, you're penalised. If you're somebody who can't work, you're judged, you're offered bare minimum support. You know, it's just ingrained in us that being disabled is terrible and sad, because we all have some level of knowledge of how disabled people are treated, and the lack of support that disabled people get. And, you know, it goes back to kind of the industrial revolution times and factories being brought in, and suddenly, you know, there wasn't any work for a disabled person, and the workers wanted to make sure that, you know, everybody kept working. So that's why the social security benefits have always been so appallingly terrible, because we don't want to make that look like a cushy deal. It's, you know, it's you kind of can't not be ableist, and it's all about kind of just challenging it. Like, I still am so, like, my first reaction, like my first thought sometimes, I'm like, oh my God, Nina, what, that would get you cancelled. And, you know, and it's like the second thought that counts, because the first thought is the one that we're all brought up with. It's the one that, you know, we just have to undo. And it's the second thought that comes in, you replace it and go, well, no, that's not actually true. You know, and it's just about recognizing that. And I think with disability and with ableism especially, people just, it's hard because
people like to close their eyes because they don't like to see the problems. And people like to turn a blind eye to it, because as soon as you point out something as ableist or there's a massive barrier to entry, it's almost like, I'm not a bad person though. I'm not a bad person for doing this. Like, oh, because I didn't think about access, I'm not a bad person. Like, my architect should have thought about that. Well, no, like, stop chatting shit. It's rubbish. You're all ableist. Accept it. But like, as soon as you accept it, you can like learn from it. So like, accept it and now learn.
I think people just don't really, I think people don't necessarily see, you know, and I'm generalizing, but disabled people as human. Like,
no, and I would completely agree with you on that. I honestly would, because I think that's a very true statement.
Well, I think, you know, when we look at things like silly things like, it's not really silly at all, but there was like disabled bus passes in certain areas of the country cannot be used after 9 p.m, as if all disabled people, you know, are tucked up in bed by 9 o'clock. Be werewolves. Like we are werewolves, which maybe we are. But, you know, I think that we're not expected to want a social life, education, work, blah, 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 blah. So it's just sort of not, it's, I think it's, people just find it so uncomfortable. But you know, everybody's only kind of one accident, one chronic illness from becoming disabled. Or you know, you get old enough, you've got the privilege of living long enough, you're going to probably become disabled. And it's infuriating, because if people were to, you know, if everywhere was accessible and not just wheelchair accessible, you know, it benefits everyone. When we look at the shit that they put in place in the pandemic for non-disabled people overnight, like my other half was up in the city working, and he literally had his computer like motorbike to his house within however many hours, and he was set up to work from home like that. And I just, and I think obviously there was a lot of talk about it in the community at the time, how, wow, all of this stuff we've asked for and have always said it's not possible, suddenly it is possible. And as we've also seen, most of it's been, stripped away, and everybody's trying to champion everybody back to the office. But as we saw during lockdown, people kind of benefited from that way of life. People benefited from suddenly being able to have doctor's appointments over the phone, and being able to do online stuff and work from home and this and that. And, when we talk about access, when you meet those access needs, it generally benefits everybody else.
Yeah. It's not just the disabled community that it benefits, it's everybody else. It's productivity. It's like, it's everything on top of that. And initially it might look like it's just the disabled community that it benefits, but actually it's a knock-on effect to absolutely everyone, because while someone might be in the disabled community, they're also a part of a wider community as well. You're not just part of one area, you're part of lots of like loads of little different things as well, and that knock-on effect is huge. And like it's never ending. So like, I'm in complete agreement with everything that you've just said, and I think you've said it in such a way that makes it accessible for everybody else to understand as to why the access is needed, which I love. So with this, how has your disability impacted your career and the career choices that you've made?
I mean, I'm just really lucky. Like, I don't know. So for like a long time, I sort of just realized when I was younger that I wasn't able to work a regular job because I was just always off, or I would be able to work fine for a couple of months and then need like 6 months off. So didn't really work out that well. So for a long time, I just didn't work. And then I retrained to be a counsellor, which I did for a little bit, self-employed, and then had babies, and my disability sort of progressed, I guess. And like what I'm doing now just feels like a huge sort of accident, that I'm suddenly like making money on social media. Like, it's weird. It's very strange. But, I know that I'm really, really lucky because I'm able to work from home, and I don't have to deal, well, I do still have to deal with silly people, but in general it's not so bad. So I think I've sort of I don't know, somehow at the minute I don't know what I'm going to do after this, because making money from social media feels very, very like making money, I don't know, it feels very unsteady. So I'm not sure what I'll do next from this, but I think like I still sort of use I think I've been able to take a lot of my counselling skills as well into sort of my disability work, which has been really useful, because a lot of it, like, we never covered disability when I did my training. And I know from speaking to a lot of disabled people that they can have real issues with therapy, because often their therapist is ableist, because everybody is. And if you're telling somebody with if somebody comes to you and they've got a visible disability, and they sort of said to you as a therapist, like, I feel really anxious when I go into a room full of people I don't know, that therapist might be like, well, that's really irrational. Let's, CBT your way out of that. Whereas actually it's quite rational to feel like that as a disabled person, because we know that at any point somebody could just come up and either, laugh at us or say something really hateful to us, or, so I think, for me, it's been really good to be able to use those skills within a disability setting and to reframe things, because, it's not, I think often, depression and anxiety can go hand in hand when you're disabled, because I think when you're of any marginalised group, because of how oppressive, and all of the systems and all of everything, I think it's very hard to, flourish under all of that. So I think being able to use those kind of skills to help sort of other people to realize that, like, it's not me, it's ableism, and to get that sort of strength from that is probably, you didn't even ask this, but it's probably the favorite part of my work.
No, but that's great, because it does tie into like how it has impacted your career, because you've gone down one route and then you've come out and been able to use those skills and place them somewhere else, which I think is brilliant. And something that I love that you do is when you talk about yourself and your partner, and the image that comes to mind is the image, I think it's you in a wheelchair and your partner stood beside you, and next to it you've written, like, next to him it's like savior, so great, like he must be like an absolute saint, and then next to you it's like burden, awful, must be a terrible person. And I love that so much, because a lot, you know, talking about relationships with disabled people, that is so often what happens. People either think your partner is your carer, or they're in shock. People are like in shock that disabled people can have like relationships and sex lives and all of these things that happen, because it's you never see it. Like I have never seen a disabled person as the main character in any type of sexy film, or like, you know, any romantic love interest in any TV show, soap, drama, whatever. It doesn't happen. And I love that you confronted that so much, and I think that it needs to happen so much more.
I think it's really important, like, because although I've always been disabled, obviously I've only been using a wheelchair full time for the last 3 years. And Jace takes on a lot more around the house now than he did before. Literally, he was ill the other morning and I was in charge of doing like the morning before school thing, and I just like cried. And I used to do it all the time. I was a single mum for like 2 years, and I just I cried. I can't cope with it, Jace.
Get out of bed. You are not sick.
You're not that unwell. You're fine.
You have man flu.
So I have got he is great. But it's about that. So like I was married before, and I did everything. Like I did every bit of housework, and I did all the admin, and I did everything, because at the time I wasn't working, I was just a mum. And I think that kind of outdated notion, and that kind of, I think it plays into gender roles as well, that if your man is working and the woman is at home being a housewife, like it's so outdated. But I think archaic. It's that sort of mindset, because I think when they look at us and they're like, oh, that poor guy, because obviously they imagine that he does everything, and we have no sex and he can't possibly get any enjoyment from his poor disabled partner. And it's just it's not like that, because we've operate so smoothly as a team. And my strength is organization, and Jace's terrible at that, so I'm basically the house manager, and Jace does all the manual lifting and stuff, and it's great. And like, for we've always had a lovely relationship, but it's got so much better the more disabled I've got, which feels like a weird thing to say, but I think I've always been quite an independent, overly like that, because independence is such a it's a crap notion, and it's just a false sort of thing that's sold to how everyone should be. And I think I've sort of really took that on board, and if I ever used to fall over, I'd be like, I can get up myself, and just I'm fine, I'm strong, and just had all these ideas of what I had to be, and dismantling that and realizing how much that tied in with all the messages around disability, and really allowing Jace to care for me has, like, it's just been lovely. We're so much more intimate, which in turn it can't help but have a knock-on effect in every area of your relationship, which means everything is better, because it's just a lovely, and I've had quite a lot of relationships and they've all been terrible, and this is the first time I've ever just had this real genuine kind of the idea of what care means, because I care for him and he cares for me, and that looks slightly different. Like, I'm not physically being able to pick him up and shit. I mean, Jace can barely pick me up, to be fair. But it's lovely. And the fact that people look at disabled people and just automatically presume that they can't, or they shouldn't, there's laws in countries about people with learning disability, like not being able to have sex. Like, it's terrible.
It's wild. It's genuinely wild.
Really, like, it's awful. And I wish it was something that was spoken about. I know there's like really great people doing amazing work around it, but in general, when we look at schools, when we look at sex ed, there's just no mention of it. So I think for a lot of disabled people, because our bodies are so medicalized, especially if you've grown up with a disability, then often the times you are touched and stuff is always very medical. And again, you can internalize that and feel like your body is just this like medical thing, and undoing that and learning that actually, I spent a long time, like, I would never let people touch the lump on my back. Like, that was a no-go area. Like, why would you touch that? Whereas with Jace, I do, and it feels lovely. And it was so kind of healing for me to have somebody touch it in an intimate way, in a nice way, as opposed to just like this cold gloved sort of hand. And it always just kind of makes me laugh, because I think all the like disabled people I know, all my friends, they've got just lovely relationships. They've got some of the best relationships that I know with, you know, the few good straight men that I like. So that's nice.
If you can find one, send them my way.
I will. But yeah, the idea that it's somehow a flaw, or, you know, and I think it's just, you know, people just have narrow-minded views on everything, don't they? And they have narrow-minded views of what sex looks like, and, you know, sex must be this one thing. Like, it's a lot more than that. And I think people just can't imagine a different way, and I think as well, because a lot, can I say this? Is this really generalizing?
Go for it.
I think a lot of straight cis men are very much, you know, wouldn't take on somebody with a disability, wouldn't put the hoover around, you know, would think that was somehow, you know, I just think, I know from friends of mine who are single and on like the dating scene, like fucking hell, like
it's a minefield, and it's just, I don't recommend it to anyone.
No, it sounds awful. Like, really, like I was able, sort of when I was in my sort of dating years, like nobody would have known I was disabled until kind of we had sex, basically, because it's just whether I chose to disclose, you know, my feet or my back or whatever else. So I could, you know, keep it quite hidden. But the comments and stuff, but there are also really good people out there, and I always say that to people who are like, you know, I'm never going to find somebody because of that. And it's like, no, it's a really good arsehole detector, and then that way it's not you, get rid of them and then on to the next one, because there are really decent people. And and I don't think, you know, I think everybody, you know, I think it's natural that somebody's probably going to put their foot in it or say something, maybe, because none of us are, you know, we're not all there. But I think you can definitely tell the ones that
try, and there are other people who just balls it right up.
Or people who just won't eat, or just say something so horrible and outrageous and gross.
I mean, like, dating is it's such an interesting one, because I started this whole like dating thing maybe like last year, after like coming out of a relationship. It was a really long-term relationship, and then I was like, oh, like, I don't really know what this dating thing is. And I remember like my first time going on a dating app, and I was like, I'm just gonna put pictures of me out there, like, it's very obvious I've got a disability. If you like me, you like me. If you don't, you don't. It's no skin off my back. And then I remember I got a message from one guy who was like, I've also only got one hand too. And I was like, cool, that's not necessarily the reason that we should match.
Imagine if that's the only thing you've got in common.
Exactly. And it's just, you know, it's a really funny one, because, and I was saying this to a friend the other day, I was like, you know, people are either going to like me or they don't, and if they don't, then they're not for me, and that's absolutely fine. And actually it's perfect, because I wouldn't want them in my life anyway. And like you said, it's a perfect arsehole detector. Like, you're going to know whether someone's interested or scared of disability as soon as you start speaking to them. So it's kind of like the best way to just be like, yeah, I'm here, I'm disabled, accept it or not, see you later, if not, bye-bye. Absolutely.
And I think it's just finding that right person who also understands that, you know, interdependence is the key to everything. You know, I have interdependence with my friends, and I have it with Jace, and, you know, we all rely on each other for different things, and just how beautiful care can be, like taking care of somebody and somebody letting you into that part of their lives, I think is really special as well. Like, I don't think it should be about, oh God, you know, when am I going to tell them this big dark secret about myself? No, it's it's a beautiful thing. It's your story to tell to, you know, to somebody if you trust them with it. And, you know, it's certainly not something that's like a flaw about a person.
No, not at all. And I always ask, like, through some, like, you know, we all go through hardship with disability, and like, this is, you know, as much as I love talking about disability and its positives and all the positive impacts it's had on my life, there is hardship that we all go through with it, in one form or another. But I always try and look for some form of goodness that comes out of the hardship. And I was wondering, do you have you noticed a particular personality trait through going through hardship with your disability that actually you're really proud of?
Oh, that's a big question.
It's a good one, isn't it?
It is a good one. I'm not sure. I think like I've always been somebody that has always been quite socially anxious, and I didn't have a very nice time at school. So I've always been like a bit of a people pleaser and this sort of thing. And I think for me, like what I've done the most, what's come out of me over the last couple of years is I seem to have developed I've always had a maternal parenting side that I've been able to apply to my friends and my children, but I've always maybe not been as good at applying it to me. Yeah. So I think not since becoming disabled, because I was born disabled, but since becoming a wheelchair user and having to confront all of this stuff and deal with people staring at me and deal with just having a platform where, you know, I leave myself quite vulnerable a lot of the time, it sort of has terrified the 15-year-old me who still is like just terrified of everything. But it's also enabled me to develop this really lovely kind of grounded, slightly feels like an older, wiser side of myself that kind of comes in those moments and is really able to talk to that other part of myself. So I'm able to have like a conversation, kind of to parent myself. And I'm really proud of you know, I sort of did my own therapy, you know, during lockdown, and it was just a really nice sort of part of myself to be able to develop, to kind of just to look after myself, because sometimes things are really shit. And sometimes I do have days like, you know, I'll get messages sometimes like, how are you so positive? And I'm like, but I'm not. Like, I have days when I burn out and I take, you know, and Jason's like, you just need to go have a bed day. And I'm in bed and I'm sad, or I feel really anxious. But I've got much better at just being so kind to myself, I think. Whereas before I'd have pushed through it and been like, oh, you're being, you know, just called myself all sorts of names and you've got nothing to moan about, blah, 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 blah. I don't do any of that now. Now I'm just like, okay, you feel like shit and that's okay. And, you know, and I can just be kind to myself. And I think it's quite a harsh world sometimes when you're disabled. So having that ability to inwardly be nice, you know, to make that choice to be nice to yourself. That's what I think I'm proud of, being able to develop that.
For sure. I feel like I need to develop that. I am the person that's so like, I was literally saying this the other day. I am like my harshest critic, and like I forget that I'm disabled, because obviously like you, I was born with my disability, so I don't know any different. And it's not until someone says something, or like I look at someone like really, really simple, like clapping their hands, and I'm like, oh, like I don't clap my hands like that. And like I have moments where I'm like, today I just feel a bit shit. And like it's purely just, you know, we do have days where we just don't feel great, but then I'm like, come on, Brooke, like you've got to power through, like you can do this, like what are you moaning about? You've got nothing to moan about. And then I'm like, oh god, this is tiring.
Whereas, you know, if your friend came to you, you'd probably be a lot more empathic.
Oh my god, I'm like the nicest friend ever. I would love to be friends with me. I'm such a good friend.
Well, then you need to be turning that energy inwards.
It's funny that I say that, because I remember saying it to a friend of mine, and she was like, you're the only person I know that could get away with saying that and like genuinely meaning it. And I was like, yeah, I genuinely mean it. Like,
I do that. I know I am.
I'm a really good friend. Like, I'm not bullshitting anyone. I'm a nice human being. I have that much self-belief.
That's good. It's good. You know, fully support having self-belief. It's nice. And it's a good base point to sort of remind yourself, you know, am I talking to myself like a really good friend?
Yeah. And that's something that I've learned, is that always treat yourself like your own best friend. And like I'm developing it. It's not easy and it is hard, but you've got to do it.
Even like that part that's really kind of critical of you, though, is doing it in your own best interest, because it's like, well, if I don't really criticize her, then she might fuck up, and then, oh my god, what will happen to us then? So it's also about kind of being able to be nice to that part of yourself and be like, hey, I know you're concerned, but we're okay.
I always ask this because I think this is a really like important question, because I think if I'd heard someone like older than me when I was little with the same disability as me give out a piece of advice, I probably would have really listened. And that is, do you have like a piece of advice for either for a younger version of yourself and also or a younger person with the same disability as you?
I mean, for myself, and well, the same really, for anybody younger with it, I think it's to find community if you can. Like, I almost shied away from it a little bit when I was younger, and I wish I hadn't. And I think I would just want to say to anybody to really understand that it isn't you, that all of this stuff you feel when you feel like a burden, when you feel, like you're an inconvenience and all of this, you're not. It's, it's how society is. Yeah. And I would just say to anybody younger that, your disability can be, it is a beautiful thing, and it's a neutral thing, and your life, you're going to make your life what you're going to make of it. And just, it's not you, it's ableism, always.
It's always ableism.
Always is, always. That's my excuse even at home. No, it's not my fault, it's ableism. I definitely didn't do it.
I'm gonna start saying that now at home. I'll be like, oh, it's not my fault, it's ableism.
I also really enjoy calling the children ableists when they leave their shoes around. I'm like, you're so ableist.
How do they take it? And they're like, oh, sorry, mum. Or they're like, oh, mum, stop it.
They just laugh. They laugh at me with their hazards.
I love that.
Terrible children.
I love that. Interestingly, I have a particular set of questions that I find really intrusive / really, really annoy me. And it tends to be, did a shark bite your arm off? Because people love that. Wow. Or alternatively, what happened? Now, I wondered if you had like a particular set of questions that you find intrusive about your disability. And I know that you spoke about your first post being about the questions that you found really annoying. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit more.
Yeah, it's weird because I think it's weird, but I used to get the most questions when I use crutches or a walking stick versus the wheelchair, because people tend to just ignore me. Now I'm in the wheelchair, but it was always, what have you done? What happened to you? Yeah. Always. People don't tend to, I don't know, people are so kind of awkward around the chair that I don't even really get that. I still do occasionally. Yeah. I don't tend to get it with people, whereas I would literally get strangers come up and ask me. I don't tend to get that in the chair, but we did have, we had a door fitter, we're gagging at my door fitter. I think it's like last year, who made some it's something, and when someone says something but then they carry on talking, and they're so that you don't get a chance to put your point across. Yeah. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like, oh, it's a shame, or you're so young to be in that, or something. And then as I started to sort of go, well, no, he just and because it was in my house as well, it made me feel even more vulnerable, because it's like on my
it's
turf.
Like on your territory, isn't it?
Not into it. So yeah, it's the same thing. It tends to be, what happened? How did you end up in that wheelchair? Yeah. And I don't know, maybe people are just so scared of disability and they're so worried about it that they're just trying to find all the different reasons you can possibly become disabled, so they can try and avoid it forever, which is never going to happen.
But I also think, to a certain extent, and I spoke to the Rolling Explorer about this, is that actually it can be seen as a form of entertainment, because people almost want that morbid story that something devastating happened to you, and that's how you became disabled or you acquired your disability. Whereas, shock, horror, surprise, surprise, people can just be born disabled, and that is just their life. There was no tragic story, there was no tragic event. Don't get me wrong, there are people whose reality that very much is, but by asking questions such as what happened, what did you do, it's so intrusive. You don't know what domino effect you're setting off for someone else.
It can be so triggering. Yeah. But I think, like you say, disabled people have always been held up as medical curiosities. Yeah. If we look at kind of sideshow freak days, to even every single time a disabled person is on the telly or in the media, you will know what their diagnosis is.
Yeah, completely.
More often than not, when I am spoke about or interviewed or whatever else, my diagnosis will be up there. Yeah. And I think it's people generally feel that they are entitled to know, as if we don't have that autonomy or right to privacy that everybody else does, because people are so sort of affronted when you don't tell them as well.
Yeah. And it's almost like they believe that they deserve that story from you. And you're like, yeah. I don't have a story. There is no story. It is what it is.
Oh, mine used to go when I stopped sort of telling people sort of my whole what spina bifida was and how it works, and literally talked to them for about 10 minutes, and I just sort of started saying nothing's wrong with me, I was just I was born disabled, and then they'd be like, oh, I'm sorry, and then I'd be like, don't have to be sorry, I'm fine, I've got a great life, thanks. Whereas now, you know, the rare times it happens, it would be more a case of, oh, I don't actually talk about my medical information with people I don't know.
Yeah, so like simple and to the point.
And also makes them look like a nosy fucker, which they are.
Yeah, so true. You know what's so interesting is that I didn't actually know what my medical diagnosis was until the beginning of this year. So bear in mind, like, I lived my entire life, my like, edit my age out, my 27 years of age. I literally had no idea what it was. And it wasn't until I had to like prove my disability for a fitness competition from like a drop down box of what it could be that I had to Google every single option, because I had not a notion what any of them were. And I was literally like, I have no, I even rang my friend who's also not the same disability as me. And I was like, do you know what your disability is? And he was like, yeah, like, I'm an amputee. And I was like, okay, well, that doesn't really help me out. And I was like, I don't know why I thought you know the answer, but like, you're disabled as well, so I thought you might. But I didn't know what my diagnosis was until earlier this year, which is like, it's genuinely wild, isn't it?
I probably don't know a lot of my friends' diagnosis. My brain just doesn't withhold information very well. But also because it's not, you know, it's important to an extent. You know, I've got friends, it's very important to me that I know what my friends' access needs are and allergies and all of that sort of stuff. But when it comes to actual, well, I've got this, and this, I don't, because it's not relevant.
Yeah. And like, it's so true. Like, it's just absolutely not relevant. And the only reason I know like a lot of people's medical history is because of this podcast, because they're like, oh, that this is what it is. And I'm like, oh, great. But like, if we met on the street, there's no way that I'd be like, so what is it?
No, I think like, for me, like, I think having, you know, talking about spina bifida, I think can be really helpful, because for a lot, I think most parents who get a spina bifida diagnosis when they're pregnant, I think like 85% will go on to have a termination. And for the people who don't, I know that it can be really scary, because the doctors are very much like, oh, you know, and it
classic doctors.
And it can rob people of the chance to enjoy their pregnancy or to be excited, because it's cloaked in so much fear. So, you know, I will always advocate that as an adult, I, you know, will talk about spina bifida for that reason, because I don't think children with spina bifida, which is often the case, should be, you know, their parents should be using them as an educational tool to educate people on the internet, because I think disabled kids should be allowed to have their medical privacy. So I will step up and talk about spina bifida for that reason.
That exactly, that point I think is so important, is that I personally find it incredibly difficult. And I mean, like, there's a part of my core that hurts when I see a disabled child on the internet promoting whatever about their disability, because they're too young to necessarily know what they're talking about in terms of like disability and how it works in society. And I'm talking about like young kids here, I'm not talking about like teenagers. And there's something about it that I find so wrong.
Do you know what? I used to do it, not to the extent that I've seen, but when my kid who's got spina bifida was younger. So I get it. I completely get the mindset, because you are literally told the whole way through your pregnancy that, you know, your baby shouldn't really be here. I understand that need to kind of want to share them with such pride. And I definitely overshared physio appointments and stuff like that, until I really realized was when he would come home from school and excuse me, be fed up that people were asking intrusive questions of him. And I would say, well, you don't have to answer. Just tell them, you know, it's none of their business. But then I was like, but I've kind of written all about it on the internet. So how's that? And it was a real moment for me of, whoa, I need to sort my parenting boundaries out here, which I did. And I've had so many parents who have taken it in that way as well, who have said, God, you know what? Yeah, you are absolutely right. I would hate it if my parent, you know, my mum shared a load of my private medical information on the internet. I'm not going to do that anymore. Yeah, so quite a few years ago, when I started talking about stuff, a mum of a kid with spina bifida messaged me and said, could you check, you know, I've read what you said about kids and stuff, and could you check my account, see if there's anything that... So she had a picture. Now, I think her kid was about 18 months old, and she had a picture of her catheterizing him. Now, you couldn't see his head, and I think she put a star over his penis. And I was like, okay, yeah, just a flag. I use a catheter, and if my mum even put a baby picture up of me being catheterized, I think I probably would have needed therapy for life. Now, I didn't actually say it to her like that. I think I was a little bit more tactful, but she stuck to her guns. She was very much, no, this is educating other parents. I'm keeping it up. And I then did sort of a post, not about her, but a post about not sharing kids. And basically a bunch of, when my kid was small, I was on a couple of spina bifida groups. And interestingly, they would never it felt like a lot of the parents on there never took my opinion. They would talk to me if I was coming from the angle of a mum, but if I was coming at it from the angle of a disabled adult with spina bifida, they were always a bit, I was a little bit sort of, and basically about 3 or 4 of them who I'd met and spoke to for years on that group all messaged me furious that I'd wrote this post about boundaries, and, you know, really, like, I think I generally have a very, I don't get very much pushback at all in my account. It seems to be just a really nice community. The troll don't seem to find me, but those mums, they
can come after you. But I think it's so important to think of like the child in the future, because they can't necessarily give that confirmation right now, because they don't necessarily know what they're being exposed to, if that makes sense. So you can't predict that. But there are some accounts out there, and I'm like, oh, like, I hope someone can pay for all the therapy you're going to need. Like, I really hope so, because I think you're going to need a lot.
Like, my kid is 8 now, and he has no idea really. You know, he would love to have this big public account for one of his interests that he's got. And I have to explain to him that no, the internet is, you know, once something's out there on the internet, it's out there forever. And what you would be okay with me sharing now, or with yourself sharing now, you might not necessarily be okay with in another 5 years, in another 6 years. And, you know, I just cannot, the thought of my mum even talking about me and my disability anywhere just makes me feel such a way. Like, I just would have hated it.
And I feel the exact same way, because I think had my mum, like, I don't know, like, if my mum had ever opened an Instagram account with me as a baby and like, look at this baby with a limb difference, isn't she so great? Like, or like it does something to like my insides, and I'm like, nah, I feel so uncomfortable with it. Like, it's not a nice one.
No, it's you know, it's so lovely when you kind of just see accounts who have got a disabled kid, and they share their disabled kid like they would share their non-disabled kids.
Yeah. And it's not made of like a big song and dance about.
No. So, you know, maybe they do talk about their kids' societal barriers. Because it gets to that. And I think that's the frustrating thing, because like these people get shit done. Like, there is no force like a mum of a disabled kid, or parent of a disabled kid, because there is so much admin involved, and there is so much fighting to get your child's needs met. And I just sometimes wish that energy would be put into highlighting the societal barriers, to listening to disabled adults, to sharing disabled adults. But I think obviously, you know, when you have got a disabled kid, your life does revolve a lot around the medical. And often it's not until the kid gets older that the real impact of the societal issues come into play. But it's one that makes me, because so I know some parents of disabled kids who I absolutely adore. They're brilliant, they're great. But I also know some who are, I personally think, stepping into disabled spaces when they shouldn't be. Like, I don't believe parents of disabled kids should give talks on disability. No, I just think that should be left to disabled adults, because our voices aren't heard enough as it is. And I don't know, I start like the kind of identity as well, you know, autistic mum, special needs mum. Like, I'm not a fan. Like, I wouldn't want my mum to make her identity about me. Yeah. But I also recognise, and I feel like disabled parents don't get enough support. And I do think it's important that they have support and they have community. but I feel like that community should be built in a way that still protects
the child,
their kids' privacy, like be on a forum like Mumsnet or whatever else, but we don't need to share pictures of, you know, our kids being catheterized even in a private group. You know, it's thinking about, well, would I be happy with somebody sharing this picture of me on the toilet, you know, without my consent? Probably not.
Wouldn't be the prettiest picture.
No, I wore a play suit yesterday because it was hot, and taking that down to go to the toilet, and it was like 3 PM. I've left the bathroom door open, and then I'm like, Jace, I'm naked on the toilet, can you shut the door please, because one of the boys is probably going to come downstairs, and they're not going to be that happy about it because it is a sight. So yeah, those kids shouldn't be shared. But yeah, I think I used to get a lot more rah about it, whereas now I'm a little bit more like, I've got a lot more empathy, and I think it is, you know, it's really hard sometimes being a parent of a disabled kid, not because of your disabled kid, but again because of all the fucking societal shit and
everything that comes along with it, because it's not
and
this is the thing, I think what I would love people to grasp is it's not actually ever the disability that's the difficult bit. It's everything else that surrounds it. So it's society, it's medical, it's like the social model of disability, it's the medical model of disability. It's never, I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes being disabled is shit, but at its base core, that's not where all of the like the difficulties stem from. It's everything else around it that it stems from, like, you know, how people are viewed in society, and like how the medical world view disabled bodies and disabled people, and it's everything else that encapsulates that as well. That's the bit that's difficult to deal with, and when you're constantly fighting against it day in day out, that's when the problems are arising.
Absolutely. And I think even like with some of my friends who have a chronic illness, who, you know, can be in immense amounts of pain and things, and, you know, their disability is obviously, you know, they view that differently to, say, myself, who isn't in any physical pain, well, sometimes, but not, you know, I'm not in chronic pain. But even with my friends, they are still getting shit healthcare. They're still not getting the healthcare they need. So although, you know, their disability is incredibly hard, sometimes it is made even harder by the fact that, you know, that they can't get a doctor's appointment, or the doctor doesn't believe them, they can't get a diagnosis, they can't get the treatment they need, or the treatment stopped. You know, it's you know, like sometimes you find yourself talking about it all, and then you're like, it's so bad, like it's so bad, and I don't think people realize how bad it is. But then you kind of feel like, oh god, all I'm doing is just like this. It's because it is like it's,
but it's the truth. And that's, I think, what's scary is that it can be very easily swept under the rug. Like the reality of like the medical model of disability, for example, like can be so easily swept under the carpet because, you know, we're England and we have the NHS, and the NHS is wonderful. And I'm not saying that the NHS isn't wonderful, it is, and we're so lucky to have it. However, there are massive flaws in the system, huge flaws in the system, especially when it comes to disabled people. And that's physical, that's intellectual, that is everything that it comes with it. There's so little knowledge about disability that even the specialists are being taught by the disabled people.
I feel like the NHS is great if you are fixable or you're going to get better. But if you're not fixable and you're not going to get better, then it's pretty shit. Like, I don't know a disabled person that hasn't got some sort of medical trauma. And, you know, there's a bajillion different reasons that make it, you know, our palliative care isn't just for end of life. Palliative care should support people with long-term conditions, and that's what we don't have. We don't have the knowledge, as you say. You know, most of us are teaching the doctors about our conditions, and we don't have that. You know, I think a lot of doctors are very much about the fixable, you know, I need to have that payoff, because that must be the payoff, right? If you're a doctor, you fix someone and then you get your little, oh, I did that.
Yeah, like, woohoo, I prescribed antibiotics.
Aren't they great? But, you know, you can't get that with somebody who is in a wheelchair. You know, I'm not getting better, so you just have to help me look after everything, but they don't. And I think there's also, you know, I mean, maybe it's just like the old cynic in me, but, you know, I think there's a lot of it tied up with capitalism, tied up with productivity. You know, who are we fixing here? The people that we're going to get back out making them money. And I think, you know, when we see that in the value of, you know, we saw that in, you know, I know I've said this already, but we saw that in the value being placed on our lives during the pandemics, if it's done, but during, you know, during lockdown, during the first 2 years of it, was just shocking. It was literally like, disabled people won't be saved. Oh, great.
Yeah. I don't envy anyone who's having to go through like a medical journey at this point in time, because especially with everything that's gone on the past like 2.5 years, everything's been backed up as well. So
it was really like, I remember a friend of mine saying to me, look, she said, I'm not trying to scare you. She said, but if you catch it and you have to go to A&E, you have to go to hospital, she said, make sure you've got some pictures of the kids and the family, and you know, and you and Jason, the kids in your pockets. So I was like, why? She's like, just to really humanize yourself. And literally she was like, make sure they know that you're a mum, make sure they know you've got family, because it can be just so easy for them, you know, if it comes to it, to just go, oh, well, she's in a wheelchair. And, you know, I think a lot of people be like, what? No. But it's true. And we, you know, and we saw it happening.
Well, look at what happened with adults who are like learning difficulties, having signed DNRs from their doctors.
Yeah,
that's vile. I work in that specific area, and when that came out, I remember thinking, I have to ensure that none of my clients get COVID, because none of them deserve that, because that's nobody's judgment to make. It's not a doctor's judgment to make.
It's not. You can't possibly pick, you know, whose life deserves to live or not. Like, it's way too.
This is not survival of the fittest. Like, this is not what this is.
No, but then that's what people, but then I literally heard people say that in front of me as well. And I was like, no, like,
it's so wild, isn't it?
Yeah, the ableism, like, you know, the casual ableism and the not so casual ableism that is just allowed to be sort of thrown around without any sort of questioning is, quite shocking, I think.
So to make this conversation just a little bit brighter, because I feel like
it took a turn.
We went down like a little hole. It was a good hole, and it's definitely something needed to be discussed, but it was a hole nonetheless. My final question to you is, Nina, are you disabled and proud? Yes,
very, very much so. And I feel so nice being able to say that, because I spent so many years being disabled and ashamed, and being able to go, no, I'm so freaking proud to be in this community. Like, it feels like a real privilege and a treat just to be a part of such a diverse, amazing, interesting community of people. Very proudly disabled.
Yay. I have genuinely loved this chat, and I think a lot of things that we've spoken about have needed to be said, and it's been wonderful to, I don't know whether you find this, but when I speak to other disabled people, there's a lot of nuances that everybody understands, that had I been having this conversation with an able-bodied person, it would have fallen short.
I tell you what happened to me today, and why I was really looking forward to this chat, because I knew for that exact reason. So I'd got asked if I would like to come and give a talk for a company. And the person who reached out and asked me was obviously really well-meaning, really nice. She follows me on Instagram.
Yeah.
But today I went to the pre-talk meeting, and it was her and her manager. Now, her manager didn't know about me, didn't know my work, has no idea about ableism and disability and anything else. And he was like, I was like, what do you actually want me to come and talk about? And he's like, well, you know, you can come tell your story, you can be inspiring. I was like, no. And then he used the term wheelchair bound about 4 or 5 times. And I was like, I couldn't be done with challenging it there and then, because I just sort of wrapped the call up really quick and then sent her an email like, this isn't the right fit for me. And I could have educated him, but he was basically, the reason I said it wasn't the right fit for me is because he was going to be doing the interviewing. And I thought, I can't do a live Zoom interview like for other people with somebody who potentially is going to say really ableist things to me. And I'm not going to want to call him in front of.
Yeah, like, I would love to rip you a new one, but you're going to have your employees and it's going to be very embarrassing for you. So I'll just spare you that embarrassment.
Yeah. And it was like, this isn't the one, because generally when I come and do, you know, if I'm doing any sort of talks, it's normally for, even if it's for big organizations, it's normally for the disability group within that. So it's always lovely. But this yeah, so I was like, oh, can't wait to do this one, because I just knew that, like you say, you just don't have to caveat anything.
No, and that's what's so great, is that you don't have to caveat anything. And like I said, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, you can also say that sometimes you just hate your disability. Doesn't mean that you hate being disabled, but sometimes it can just be a little bit shit, and that is fine.
Yeah, I always look at it as big D and little d. I can hate my disability with a little d, but I will always love being disabled, with a capital D. And that's, having a spine lifter is not always great. Sometimes I do miss being able to walk and all of those things. But, I think we're all cautious about saying it out loud, because I feel like there's a non-disabled person just waiting to jump out of a bush and be like, I told you so, I knew it was shit. So I only ever say it in safe spaces like this. So shit, they're right, it's terrible, but no, you know what I mean.
Oh, honestly, thank you so much for coming on today. I've genuinely loved this chat, because we've spoken about so many things that I like. I love speaking about this disability, but also it's so nice to be able to talk to someone who also is, I like to think I'm quite eloquent. I also think you're really eloquent, and it's been nice to have that conversation and like have it flow. And I've really loved this. So thank you for giving up your time and coming on the podcast.
Of course, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your evening.
You too. See you later on.
Bye.